The volcanic ash clung to everything. February 23rd, 1945, somewhere north of Airfield No. 2 on Iwo Jima. Corporal Frank Morrison crouched behind what remained of a blackened tree stump, watching the ungainly machine lumber into position barely 200 yards ahead of his platoon. The vehicle looked wrong for this close to the front lines, too tall, too exposed, with that peculiar pulpit-like ring mount jutting from its right side like an afterthought. Morrison had seen plenty of Shermans grinding through the volcanic sand, their 75mm guns hammering at Japanese positions. But this wasn't a Sherman. This was something the artillery boys were supposed to keep miles behind the lines, lobbing shells in high arcs over the heads of fighting men. Yet here it sat, its long barrel depressed almost flat, pointed directly at a concrete bunker that had murdered half a dozen Marines in the past hour alone. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The M7 priest wasn't supposed to be here. Not like this, not doing this. Everything about its presence violated the careful doctrines that separated indirect fire artillery from direct fire assault guns. But Iwo Jima had a way of making peacetime regulations irrelevant. The crew commander, a barrel-chested staff sergeant whose name Morrison never learned, was doing something that would have earned him a reprimand at any stateside training base. He was hunting bunkers like a tank destroyer, using a self-propelled howitzer designed for firing at targets miles away as a point-blank siege weapon. The Marines called it bunker sniping. The artillery officers had another name for it, though they rarely said it aloud. Improvisation born of desperation. The story of how the M7 priest ended up in this role, how a piece of mobile artillery became one of the most effective bunker-busting weapons in the Pacific, reveals something fundamental about Iwo Jima itself. This wasn't a battle that followed anyone's pre-war playbook. The island forced every weapon, every tactic, every assumption to adapt or become irrelevant. And for 6 Marines crewing one particular priest on that gray February morning, adaptation meant doing something their vehicle was never designed to do, using it in ways that contradicted every manual they'd ever studied. What made this particularly striking was the weapon they were using. The M7 carried a 105mm M2A1 howitzer, a weapon designed for lobbing heavy shells in graceful parabolic arcs over hills and ridges to strike targets the gunner couldn't even see. Its barrel was built for indirect fire, for coordinates and calculations, for the mathematics of elevation and deflection. Maximum range, 11,400 yards. Maximum elevation, 35 degrees. These specifications told you everything you needed to know about what the M7 was meant to do. It was supposed to sit hull down in a defilade position, well behind the infantry, and rain steel on distant targets called in by forward observers. Yet here, the barrel pointed nearly level, aimed at a target the crew could reach out and touch. The howitzer that was designed to shoot at targets 6 miles away was being used like a direct fire gun against something 200 yards distant. This was either battlefield innovation or a court-martial waiting to happen, depending on which officer you asked. To understand how profoundly wrong this scene would have appeared to any pre-war artilleryman, you have to understand what the M7 priest actually was. The vehicle Morrison watched had been born from a crisis of mobility in the early months of American rearmament. In June 1941, 6 months before Pearl Harbor, the Army's armored force had faced a fundamental problem. Their new doctrine called for fast-moving, mechanized divisions that could sweep across battlefields at unprecedented speeds. But their artillery couldn't keep up. Towed guns, no matter how well-trained the crews, required unhitching, positioning, firing, repacking, and hitching again every time the battle line shifted. By the time gunners could set up and start firing, the tanks they were supposed to support might be miles away. The solution was obvious in principle but challenging in execution. Mount the gun on a tank chassis so it could move with the armor. The result was the T-32 prototype, which became the M7 in April 1942. The design was pragmatic to the point of brutality. Take an M3 Lee medium tank chassis, remove the turret and upper hull, install an open-topped fighting compartment, drop in a 105mm Howitzer mounted slightly right of center, add that distinctive pulpit ring for a .50 caliber machine gun, and you had a self-propelled gun that could fire, displace, and fire again faster than any towed piece. The British, when they received their first M7s in North Africa in late 1942, took one look at that raised machine gun position and nicknamed it the Priest, because it resembled a pulpit. The name stuck. By the time American forces invaded North Africa during Operation Torch in November 1942, the Priest had proven itself in British service at El Alamein. The vehicle could keep pace with Sherman tanks, position itself quickly, and pour devastating fire on German positions. It was doing exactly what it had been designed to do: mobile, indirect artillery support. But mobile indirect fire and direct bunker assault are two entirely different missions, requiring different tactics, different positioning, different everything. Indirect fire means you can't see your target. You rely on forward observers, radios, maps, and mathematics. You sit protected behind terrain features. You fire at coordinates, not at visual targets. Direct fire means you can see exactly what you're shooting at, which also means it can see you. You're exposed, vulnerable, engaging in what amounts to a duel. The M7's armor was never meant for that kind of fight. At its thickest point, the frontal armor was barely over an inch thick, enough to stop the shell fragments and rifle bullets, but inadequate against anything serious. The top was completely open, leaving the crew exposed to grenades, mortars, and plunging fire. Using it as a bunker buster meant accepting these vulnerabilities in exchange for one overwhelming advantage: the sheer destructive power of a 105mm shell fired point blank at reinforced concrete. This wasn't how the weapon was supposed to work. But then, nothing about Iwo Jima was working the way it was supposed to. The island itself was the problem, or more precisely, the extraordinary defensive preparations that Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi had spent the better part of a year constructing. By the time V Amphibious Corps hit the beaches on February 19, 1945, Kuribayashi had transformed Iwo Jima into perhaps the most thoroughly fortified 8 square miles of ground in human history. The statistics were staggering. Over 750 major defensive installations, from simple pillboxes to vast underground complexes, 11 miles of tunnels connecting strong points, bunkers built with walls of reinforced concrete up to 5 feet thick, topped with volcanic rock and sand that absorbed shell impacts like a sponge, gun positions designed with interlocking fields of fire so that every approach was covered by multiple weapons. The most sophisticated defensive positions featured steel doors to protect artillery pieces when they weren't firing, ventilation systems to clear smoke and gases, and secondary escape routes, so defenders could retreat, reposition, and counterattack. Some bunkers were dug so deep into the volcanic rock that they survived direct hits from 16-inch naval guns, shells that weighed over 1.5 tons, fired from battleships offshore. The 3 days of preliminary naval bombardment that the Marines had expected would soften the defenses had barely scratched them. Kuribayashi's defensive philosophy was simple and devastating. Inflict maximum casualties by turning every yard of ground into a killing zone. No banzai charges, no suicidal defenses at the waterline. Instead, let the Americans land unopposed, draw them inland, then slaughter them from prepared positions that could only be reduced by close assault. It was a strategy designed to make the attackers pay in blood for every foot of volcanic ash and rock. This defensive mastery created a fundamental problem for the Marines' combined arms approach. Normally, you'd suppress bunkers with artillery and airstrikes, then send tanks forward to provide covering fire, while infantry closed for the final assault with flamethrowers and explosives. But the bunkers on Iwo Jima were built to withstand anything except a direct hit, and even then, the thickness of the concrete meant you needed sustained, repeated impacts to actually penetrate. Naval gunfire could crater the landscape, but rarely destroyed the bunkers themselves. Airstrikes could collapse tunnel entrances, but the Japanese would simply dig them out and reoccupy the position. Even Sherman tanks, the backbone of the Marine armored assault, were proving inadequate. The Sherman M4A3 medium tanks that equipped the 3 Marine tank battalions on Iwo Jima mounted 75mm guns, excellent weapons against other tanks or field fortifications, but marginal against the kind of heavy concrete construction Kuribayashi's engineers had created. The 75mm gun simply lacked the punch to breach 5-foot-thick reinforced concrete walls, especially when those walls were often angled to deflect shells and covered with layers of volcanic sand that absorbed impact energy. Tank commanders found themselves firing dozens of rounds at a single bunker, chipping away at the concrete in a slow, grinding process while Japanese defenders poured fire from adjacent positions. The after-action reports were blunt. One Marine tank battalion commander noted that the 75mm gun is not large enough, nor does it have a high enough velocity to breach heavy concrete emplacements such as were encountered on Iwo Jima. He recommended replacing it with a high-velocity 90mm gun. Another report stated flatly, the medium tank was used almost exclusively as an assault gun in destroying enemy pillboxes and blockhouses. Not quite the mobile exploitation role the tanks had trained for, but what the ground demanded. This is where the M7 Priest entered the picture, not according to any plan, but through the kind of improvisation that happens when doctrine meets reality and doctrine loses. The priests on Iwo Jima weren't part of any divisional artillery battalion. They belonged to the regimental cannon companies, small organic fire support units attached directly to infantry regiments. By late 1944, some Marine regimental cannon companies had begun receiving M7s to replace the M3 75mm gun motor carriage, essentially a 75mm pack howitzer mounted on a half-track. The M7 was supposed to be an upgrade in mobility and protection while maintaining the same mission, providing close fire support to the regiment. Close fire support didn't mean point-blank bunker assault. It meant positioning a few hundred yards behind the infantry and firing indirect missions called in by forward observers. The crews trained for rapid displacement, for responding to fire missions within minutes, for coordinating with company commanders who needed artillery support on enemy positions they couldn't quite reach with mortars. They practiced elevation tables and deflection calculations. They did not practice tank versus bunker, duels at ranges where you could see the enemy gun ports. But doctrine and training manuals don't account for 75mm guns failing to crack concrete, or for casualty rates that made every weapon system desperately needed at the front. So when Marine infantry commanders found themselves stymied by bunkers that shrugged off everything they could throw at them, they started looking around for anything that hit harder. And there, usually positioned a respectful distance behind the lines, were these ungainly vehicles with 105mm howitzers, guns that fired shells nearly 40% larger in diameter and substantially heavier than anything the Shermans carried. The first attempts were probably cautious, almost experimental. Could the priest even depress its gun low enough for direct fire? The M2A1 howitzer had a depression limit of -5 degrees, which sounds restrictive until you realize it meant the gun could point slightly downward, enough for flat trajectory shots at close range. Could the vehicle get close enough to bunkers without being destroyed? That depended on terrain, on suppressive fire from infantry, on luck. Could the shells actually penetrate the concrete? There was only one way to find out. What the Marines discovered was that a 105mm high explosive shell fired at point-blank range into reinforced concrete didn't need to penetrate on the first shot to be devastatingly effective. The shell's impact created enormous concussive force concentrated on a relatively small area. Fire enough shells at the same spot, and you could literally hammer your way through concrete, the cumulative impacts creating fractures that spread and widened with each successive hit. It was slow, methodical, expensive in ammunition, but it worked. The process looked nothing like the graceful, calculated indirect fire missions the priest crews had trained for. It looked like siege warfare compressed into minutes of thunderous violence. The priest would maneuver as close as terrain and Japanese fire allowed, sometimes 200 yards, sometimes less. The crew would identify the bunker's firing ports or weakest structural points. Then they would commence what one observer called the long-distance jackhammer technique. Shell after shell, aimed at precisely the same spot, each impact compounding the damage from the last. To Marines watching from their positions, it often seemed like nothing was happening. Most shells didn't penetrate. They'd hit, explode, throw up clouds of pulverized concrete and volcanic dust, and the bunker would still be there, still firing. But the priest crew understood the physics involved. They weren't trying to punch through in one hit. They were creating a progressive collapse, each shell weakening the structure until finally the integrity failed. The concrete would crack, then crumble, then breach, and once there was a hole, subsequent shells could enter the interior and devastate anything inside. The technique demanded different skills than traditional artillery work. The gunner wasn't calculating range tables or adjusting for wind and temperature. He was aiming like a tank gunner, making minute corrections based on where the last shell had impacted, trying to keep every round hitting within inches of the same point. The loader was feeding shells as fast as mechanically possible, because the longer you sat stationary within range of Japanese positions, the more likely something would find you. The crew commander was coordinating with infantry to ensure they knew exactly which bunker was being engaged, managing ammunition consumption, and watching for threats. It was exhausting, terrifying work. The open-topped fighting compartment meant every shell that burst overhead sent fragments raining down on the crew. Japanese mortars and artillery, alerted by the distinctive sound of the M7's prolonged firing, would try to range in on the vehicle. Snipers would look for any crew member careless enough to expose himself. The crew had to work surrounded by stacked shells and propellant charges, knowing that a single well-placed enemy round could turn their vehicle into a fireball. Yet they kept doing it, mission after mission, bunker after bunker, because nothing else was working as well. The Shermans helped, but their 75mm guns simply couldn't match the destructive power of the M7's main armament. Flamethrower tanks were devastating when they could get close enough, but many bunkers were positioned where flame couldn't reach or where the approaches were too heavily mined and defended. Naval gunfire could bracket a position with enormous shells, but the accuracy required for bunker destruction at these ranges exceeded what shipboard gunnery could reliably provide. Airstrikes were too indiscriminate and too dependent on weather and availability. The M7, for all its doctrinal inappropriateness, offered a uniquely effective combination. A gun powerful enough to destroy heavy fortifications, mounted on a platform mobile enough to reposition quickly, with just enough armor to survive in the close-range firefight environment, It wasn't designed for this role. It wasn't trained for this role. But it filled this role better than anything else the Marines had available. Word spread through the infantry units with the speed that useful information always travels in combat. If you were stuck in front of a bunker, call for the priests. Not artillery in the traditional sense. Call for direct fire support from those ungainly self-propelled howitzers. Company commanders started specifically requesting M7s for bunker reduction missions, bypassing the careful chains of command that were supposed to govern artillery employment. This created friction with some of the more traditional artillery officers, who saw their carefully positioned fire support assets being pulled forward into tank destroyer roles, exposed to risks that indirect fire weapons weren't supposed to face. They weren't wrong about the risks. M7s taking direct fire casualties was a waste of valuable equipment and trained crews from a doctrinal perspective. But Marine Infantry Company commanders watching their platoons get shredded by bunkers didn't much care about artillery doctrine. They cared about killing bunkers before bunkers killed more Marines. And the M7s killed bunkers. The crews themselves developed a pride in this unconventional role. They were doing something important, something immediately visible and valuable. When you fire indirect missions, you rarely see the results. Forward observers report effects, maps get updated, but you don't witness the destruction you're causing. When you're 200 yards from a bunker, hammering it to pieces with direct fire, you see exactly what your weapon is doing. You watch the concrete crack and fail. You see the Marines advance once the position is silenced. The cause and effect relationship is immediate and undeniable. One crew reported destroying 14 Japanese fighting positions in a single day of sustained operations. The exact timeline is lost to history, but the achievement speaks to both the effectiveness of the technique and the brutal intensity of the fighting. 14 bunkers means 14 separate engagements. 14 times maneuvering into position under fire. 14 times methodically hammering reinforced concrete until it failed. 14 times displacing before Japanese mortars could range in on your last firing position. The crew that accomplished this must have been functioning with near-perfect efficiency, every man knowing his role, ammunition consumption synchronized, movement coordinated with infantry support to ensure they weren't advancing into ambushes. The physical toll alone would have been staggering. Each M7 carried 69 rounds of 105mm ammunition in its fighting compartment, a seemingly generous load that could evaporate frighteningly quickly when you're firing multiple shells at each target. Destroying 14 positions might require anywhere from 70 to more than 100 shells, depending on each bunker's construction and the accuracy of fire. That means at least one resupply run, probably more, with ammunition carriers having to brave the same hostile terrain to keep the priest fed. The loader would have been handling over a ton of shells and propellant charges, each weighing dozens of pounds under combat conditions that made every movement a potential invitation to enemy fire. But the physical exhaustion paled beside the psychological strain. Every second spent in the direct fire role was a second exposed to retaliatory fire. Japanese defenders, recognizing the threat posed by these self-propelled howitzers, made them priority targets. Anti-tank guns would try to get side shots where the M7's thin armor was most vulnerable. Mortar crews would plot likely M7 positions and prepare concentration fires. Infantry with magnetic mines and satchel charges would try to infiltrate close enough for suicide attacks. The crew had to maintain focus through all of this, had to keep firing accurately while knowing that at any moment an enemy shell might end everything. The question of whether this employment was truly illegal depends on how strictly you interpret regulations. The M7 was classified as a howitzer motor carriage, a category distinct from tanks or tank destroyers. Its intended role, clearly defined in Army and Marine Corps doctrine, was indirect fire support. Using it in a direct fire assault role technically violated the employment guidelines that governed its use. But regulations also give commanders authority to employ available weapons as the situation demands, and the situation on Iwo Jima demanded weapons that could destroy bunkers. No Marine commander was court-martialed for using M7s in direct fire. No crew chief faced disciplinary action for bunker sniping. The exigencies of combat simply trumped peacetime doctrinal purity. In truth, the M7 wasn't alone in being pushed beyond its design parameters on Iwo Jima. Sherman tanks were being used as static artillery pieces. Flamethrower tanks were engaging in close assault roles they'd barely trained for. Even amphibious tractors were being pressed into service as makeshift armored personnel carriers long after they'd reached the beach. Everything was being adapted, modified, or outright misused according to official doctrine, because official doctrine hadn't anticipated anything like the defensive masterpiece Kuribayashi had created. The Japanese defenders noticed the M7s, of course. Their intelligence had identified these vehicles from previous campaigns, classified them correctly as self-propelled artillery, and noted their vulnerabilities. What they perhaps didn't fully anticipate was seeing them employed like tank destroyers, operating far forward of where artillery was supposed to position itself. Japanese tactical reports, the ones that survived, show confusion about why the Americans were exposing valuable artillery assets to direct fire. It didn't match the careful, methodical American approach they'd studied and prepared for. But that was precisely Iwo Jima's paradox. The careful, methodical approach wasn't working. Every plan, every doctrine, every beautifully crafted tactical solution was running headlong into fortifications that absorbed punishment and kept firing. So the Marines improvised with whatever worked, regardless of whether it matched the manual. If that meant using howitzers designed for indirect fire as bunker-busting direct-fire weapons, then that's what they did. If doctrine said artillery shouldn't be exposed in the front lines, well, doctrine hadn't figured out how else to crack 5-foot-thick concrete walls. As February gave way to March and the grinding battle continued, the M7s kept doing their unintended work. They weren't the only solution. Nothing on Iwo Jima could claim that distinction, but they were an important part of the combined arms approach that eventually reduced Kuribayashi's Fortress Island. Each bunker destroyed opened a path forward. Each pillbox silenced meant fewer Marines cut down in the volcanic ash. The crews manning these vehicles knew they were doing something their training hadn't prepared them for, using their weapon in ways that contradicted everything they'd been taught. They did it anyway, because there was no alternative that worked better. The story of the M7 priest at Iwo Jima is ultimately a story about the distance between what weapons are designed to do and what wars actually demand. It's about the gap between doctrine and desperation, between training and improvisation, between this is how it's supposed to work and this is what actually works. Those 6 Marines and their priest, hammering their way through 14 Japanese positions, weren't following any manual. They were writing a new one in real time, under fire, making it up as they went because no one had fought this kind of battle before. The transformation from artillery crew to bunker hunters didn't happen overnight, and it certainly didn't happen cleanly. In the early hours of D-Day, February 19, 1945, the M7 priests that landed with the Marine divisions weren't thinking about direct fire missions. They were thinking about survival. Getting a 25-ton self-propelled howitzer from ship to shore on Iwo Jima was its own nightmare. The M7s came ashore aboard landing ship tanks, LSTs, massive vessels designed to beach themselves and disgorge their cargo directly onto sand. But Iwo Jima's beaches weren't sand in any normal sense. They were composed of volcanic ash and cinder, a peculiar black granular material that behaved like no terrain the Marines had encountered before. Vehicles didn't roll across it, they churned through it, their tracks digging deep furrows that filled in behind them almost immediately. The priests that made it off the beach in those first chaotic hours were the lucky ones. Several bogged down completely, their tracks spinning uselessly as they dug themselves deeper into the black ash. Others struck mines that Kurebayashi's engineers had buried with meticulous care, their suspensions blown apart before they'd traveled 50 yards inland. The Japanese artillery, held silent during the initial landing to avoid revealing positions, began firing once enough targets had accumulated on the beach. Shells walked through the congested landing zone, searching for ammunition dumps, fuel stores, and massed vehicles. One priest took a direct hit from a mortar while still partially loaded on its LST, the explosion killing 3 crew members and wounding 2 others. The vehicle itself was damaged, but repairable, if anyone could get it off the beach and to a maintenance area. Another had its engine compartment penetrated by shrapnel, leaving it immobilized until a recovery vehicle could tow it to safety. These were the kinds of losses artillery units expected when they landed under fire, the calculated risks of amphibious operations. What nobody had calculated was how the next 36 days would fundamentally change what these vehicles and their crews were asked to do. The first few days on Iwo Jima followed a more conventional pattern. The priests that made it inland positioned themselves in defilade positions near Airfield No. 1, the first of the island's 3 airstrips. They registered their guns, established communications with forward observers, and began firing indirect missions in support of the advancing infantry regiments. Target coordinates would come down from observers watching Japanese movements in the rough terrain to the north. Fire direction centers would calculate the necessary data: range, deflection, elevation, propellant charge. Crews would load, aim, and fire, their shells arcing overhead to impact on enemy positions they couldn't see. This was what they'd trained for. This made sense. The reports coming back from observers confirmed that their fires were effective, that Japanese troops were being suppressed, that the mission was proceeding according to plan. Except the plan had already begun to unravel, because the Marines weren't advancing the way anyone had expected. The intelligence estimates that predicted Iwo Jima would fall in 5 days hadn't accounted for the density of fortifications or the determination of the defenders. Every 100 yards gained came at appalling cost. By D+2, February 21st, the pattern had become clear. Marine infantry would advance until they encountered a bunker complex. They'd call for fire support, naval gunfire, airstrikes, artillery. The bombardment would crater the area, fill the air with smoke and dust, make it look like nothing could have survived. Then the Marines would advance again, and the bunkers would come alive, machine guns raking the volcanic ash, mortars dropping with horrifying precision. The fortifications weren't just surviving the bombardment. They were designed to survive it, with overhead cover that could withstand near misses from the heaviest naval shells. The problem was obvious. Indirect fire wasn't destroying bunkers. It might kill Japanese troops caught in the open, might disrupt communications, might make the defenders keep their heads down temporarily. But the moment the bombardment stopped, the bunkers came back to life. What the infantry needed was something that could directly engage these fortifications, something that could put shells precisely where they needed to go, repeatedly, until the structure failed. They needed tanks, but the Shermans weren't doing the job with their 75mm guns. The first documented instance of an M7 being used in direct fire against a bunker appears to have occurred on February 22nd, though the exact unit and location remain unclear in the fragmentary records. What's known is that a Marine company commander, faced with a pillbox that had stalled his advance for hours, called back for anything that could help. The Sherman tanks supporting his unit had fired dozens of rounds with little effect. The company's attached engineers couldn't get close enough to place demolition charges because the approaches were swept by interlocking machine gun fire from adjacent positions. Someone, a junior officer perhaps, or an NCO with the kind of tactical creativity that emerges from desperation, suggested bringing up one of the regimental priests. The vehicle was positioned a few hundred yards back, and its 105mm Howitzer packed more punch than the Sherman's gun. Could it help? The artillery crew was skeptical. They'd never trained for this. Direct fire against bunkers was a tank's job, not a howitzer's. But the company commander wasn't asking for volunteers. He was giving an order. Get that priest forward and start putting rounds into that bunker. The crew complied, maneuvering their vehicle into a position where they could see the target. The commander identified the bunker's firing aperture, a narrow slit in reinforced concrete, barely visible through the smoke and dust. He directed the gunner onto target. The gunner, accustomed to firing at coordinates on a map, now found himself aiming at something he could actually see, adjusting his sight picture like he was back in gunnery training with the old pack howitzers. The first round fired, a high explosive shell that burst against the bunker's face in a flash of orange flame and black smoke. When the smoke cleared, the bunker was still there, still firing. The crew felt a moment of deflation. All that work, all that risk of moving forward, and nothing to show for it. But the company commander was on the radio, his voice urgent. Fire again. Same spot. They didn't need to destroy it in one hit. They needed to keep hitting it until something gave way. So they fired again and again. Each shell impacted within feet of the last, the cumulative effect creating fractures in the concrete that spread with each successive hit. After the 8th or 9th round, something changed. The Japanese fire from the bunker slackened, then stopped. Smoke began pouring from the firing slit, not the smoke of explosions, but the darker, oilier smoke of something burning inside. The crew had done it. They'd hammered through the concrete, or at least created enough damage that the position was no longer tenable for its defenders. Marines moved forward, covered by the priest's machine gun, and secured the position. Inside, they found a scene of devastation. The interior of the bunker transformed into a charnel house by the shells that had finally penetrated. Word of this success spread with the speed of battlefield gossip. Within 24 hours, other Marine units were requesting priests for bunker reduction. The artillery officers initially resisted, arguing that this wasn't what the vehicles were for, that exposing them to direct fire was wasteful and dangerous. But resistance crumbled in the face of mounting casualties and the sheer effectiveness of the technique. When nothing else was working, when Marines were dying in front of bunkers that conventional fire support couldn't crack, the M7s provided an answer. The crews themselves had to learn on the job. Unlike tank crews who trained extensively for direct fire engagements, the priest crews were artillerymen, more comfortable with firing tables and deflection calculations than visual ranging and point shooting. They had to develop new skills quickly, often under fire, translating their understanding of ballistics into a very different application. The gunner had to judge distance by eye, estimate the necessary elevation, and make rapid corrections based on where shells impacted. The loader had to maintain a faster rate of fire than indirect missions typically demanded, because every second stationary in the enemy's sight line was a second inviting return fire. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The crew commander's role became particularly complex. He wasn't just managing fire missions communicated over radio. He was conducting tactical operations, coordinating with infantry, identifying targets, assessing threats, and deciding when to displace to a new position. He needed to think like a tank commander while managing a vehicle, and crew trained for completely different work. Some adapted brilliantly, Others struggled, and a few refused outright, insisting that they'd been sent to Iwo Jima to do artillery work, not tank destroyer missions. Those who refused didn't last long in their positions. The exigencies of combat made such refusals untenable. Crews that wouldn't adapt were rotated back to positions where they could conduct traditional indirect fire missions, replaced by men more willing to embrace the bunker hunting role. This created an informal sorting mechanism, where the most aggressive, tactically creative crews ended up doing the most direct fire work, while the more conservative crews stayed in conventional artillery positions. The vehicles themselves required modifications. The M7 as designed was never intended to absorb direct fire, and its thin armor reflected that design philosophy. But crews quickly learned that even modest improvements could make a significant difference in survivability. Spare track links were welded to the front glacis plate and sponsons, creating an extra layer of metal that might deflect small arms fire or detonate a magnetic mine before it could reach the main armor. Sandbags were piled around the fighting compartment, offering minimal protection against fragments and small-caliber weapons. Some crews rigged wire mesh over open areas to keep grenades from dropping into the crew compartment, a real concern when Japanese infiltrators would try to get close enough to throw explosives into the open-topped vehicle. The most elaborate modification involved constructing improvised shields around the crew positions, using whatever materials were available: scrap metal, pieces of wrecked vehicles, even heavy timber when it could be found. Crews built additional protection for the gunner and loader, the two men most exposed during firing operations. These field modifications added weight and reduced mobility, but they potentially saved lives. A crew that survived to fight another day was more valuable than one that moved slightly faster but got killed by a lucky sniper shot. Ammunition consumption became a constant concern. The M7 could carry 69 rounds internally, a respectable load for traditional artillery work, where sustained bombardments were carefully planned and ammunition expenditure was controlled. But bunker busting consumed ammunition at a frightening rate. A single well-constructed bunker might require 20 rounds or more to destroy, meaning a priest could exhaust its entire load, reducing 3 or 4 targets. This necessitated much closer coordination with ammunition supply vehicles than normal artillery operations required. The solution was to position ammunition carriers, usually tracked vehicles like the M29 Weasel, or wheeled trucks when the ground permitted, near the priest's operating areas, allowing for rapid resupply between engagements. But this created its own vulnerabilities. Ammunition carriers were priority targets for Japanese artillery, and having them positioned forward made them easier to hit. Several supply vehicles were destroyed by Japanese fire, their loads of 105mm shells detonating with catastrophic force. The crews learned to spread out ammunition stocks, never concentrating too much in one location, accepting the inefficiency in exchange for reduced vulnerability. The psychological shift that came with direct fire missions was profound. Artillery crews traditionally operate with a certain emotional distance from their targets. You fire at coordinates, at map references, at places rather than people. You know intellectually that your shells are killing enemy soldiers, destroying equipment, disrupting operations. But you don't see it happen. The forward observers see it. The infantry advancing through the areas you've bombarded see it. But the gun crews themselves are insulated from the immediate visceral reality of what their weapons do. Direct fire eliminated that distance. When you're 200 yards from a bunker, firing at it repeatedly, watching your shells impact and destroy, you're participating in combat in a much more immediate way. You see the enemy position disintegrate under your fire. You watch Marines advance through the gaps you've created. Sometimes you see Japanese soldiers emerging from destroyed bunkers, on fire from white phosphorus, or trying to retreat from positions that have become untenable. The psychological impact was significant. and not all artillerymen adapted well to it. Some crews thrived in this environment. They appreciated seeing the direct results of their work, the immediate feedback that told them they were making a difference. They took pride in their bunker-busting skills, competing informally with other crews to see who could reduce fortifications most efficiently. A few developed almost obsessive attention to detail, studying Japanese bunker construction to identify weak points, calculating the optimal angles of attack, perfecting their technique through repetition. Others found the experience deeply disturbing. Men who'd been comfortable with the abstraction of indirect fire struggled when confronted with the very concrete reality of what high explosive shells do to human beings at close range. They saw things that would follow them for the rest of their lives, images of destruction that were impossible to unsee, sounds that would echo in their memories decades later. Some requested transfers back to conventional artillery roles. Some simply endured, doing the job because it needed doing, but taking no satisfaction from it. The crew that achieved the remarkable feat of destroying 14 bunkers in a single day represented the pinnacle of this adaptation. To accomplish such a thing required not just technical skill, but extraordinary tactical awareness, perfect crew coordination, and probably a significant measure of good fortune. The timeline of 90 minutes is difficult to verify from surviving records. Such precise timing wasn't typically recorded in after-action reports, but the achievement itself appears in multiple accounts. 14 bunkers means 14 separate tactical situations, each requiring its own approach. Some bunkers would have been relatively simple targets. Straightforward fortifications with clear fields of fire, where the priest could position itself at a safe distance and methodically pound the structure until it failed. Others would have been nightmarishly complex, protected by minefields, covered by interlocking fire from adjacent positions situated in terrain that limited approach routes. The crew would have needed to assess each situation quickly, identify the best position from which to engage, coordinate with supporting infantry to suppress nearby enemy positions, then execute the fire mission with maximum efficiency. The rate of fire required to destroy 14 bunkers in 90 minutes works out to roughly 1 bunker every 6 to 7 minutes. That seems impossibly fast until you consider that not every bunker required 20 rounds to destroy. Some were less heavily constructed, more vulnerable to the 105mm shells. Some had already been damaged by previous bombardment, their structural integrity compromised. Some might have been abandoned by their defenders before the priest even fired, the Japanese having retreated through tunnels to other positions. But even accounting for these variables, the pace of operations must have been relentless. Imagine the scene inside that priest's fighting compartment. The crew commander is identifying targets, coordinating with infantry, managing the tactical situation. The gunner is acquiring each target, making split-second adjustments for range and angle, firing, observing impact, correcting, firing again. The loader is moving shells weighing over 30 pounds each from storage racks to the breach, ramming them home, grabbing the next round, maintaining this cycle without pause. The other crew members are handling propellant charges, managing communications, operating the vehicle when it needs to displace to a new firing position. The noise alone would have been overwhelming. The repeated concussion of the 105mm gun firing in rapid succession, the mechanical sounds of the breech operating, the radio chatter, the crack and whine of incoming fire from Japanese positions trying to knock out this threat. The heat would have been stifling, the enclosed fighting compartment filling with powder smoke despite the open top. The smell of spent propellant and hot metal would have been inescapable. And through it all, the crew had to maintain perfect coordination, because a single mistake, a misfired shell, a mechanical breakdown, a moment of inattention could be fatal. The physical toll would have been extraordinary. The loader handling hundreds of pounds of ammunition over the course of the engagement, would have been approaching complete exhaustion. The gunner, maintaining intense concentration for 90 minutes while making rapid, precise adjustments, would have been mentally drained. The vehicle commander, managing all aspects of the tactical situation while under fire, would have been operating in a state of sustained adrenaline that left people shaking and disoriented once it wore off. But they did it. They reduced 14 Japanese fighting positions, each one a potential death trap for Marine infantry. They opened paths forward through Kuribayashi's defensive system. They proved that the M7 Priest, used in a role it was never designed for, could be one of the most effective bunker-busting weapons in the Marine arsenal. The fact that this violated every doctrine about how self-propelled artillery was supposed to be employed became irrelevant in the face of results. The Japanese response to these tactics evolved as the battle progressed. Initial confusion about why American artillery was operating so far forward gave way to recognition that these vehicles represented a significant threat. Japanese tactical instructions began emphasizing the importance of destroying the priests before they could engage bunkers. Anti-tank guns were directed to prioritize them. Mortar and artillery crews were ordered to range in on their firing positions. Infantry with demolition charges were encouraged to attempt close assaults. Some of these countermeasures proved effective. Several M7s were knocked out by Japanese fire during direct fire missions. One vehicle took an anti-tank round through its thin side armor, killing 2 crew members and setting the ammunition on fire. The survivors barely escaped before the entire vehicle was consumed in a massive explosion as the shells cooked off. Another was immobilized by a mine, then destroyed by Japanese artillery before it could be recovered. A third was disabled by a satchel charge thrown by an infiltrator who'd gotten close during a night engagement. But the losses were acceptable in the brutal calculus of Iwo Jima, where every weapon system was being consumed at rates that would have been unthinkable in earlier campaigns. Tanks were being knocked out by the dozens. Infantry casualties were mounting to levels that shocked even hardened Marine commanders. In this context, losing a few M7s while destroying scores of bunkers was considered a good trade. The vehicles could be replaced. The bunkers, once destroyed, stayed destroyed, or at least until Japanese work parties could dig them out and reoccupy them, which was increasingly difficult as American control of the island tightened. The technique pioneered by these crews, the systematic hammer blow approach to bunker reduction, became semi-formalized as the battle progressed. Officers began specifically requesting priest support for assaults on particularly tough defensive positions. Coordination procedures were developed to ensure infantry knew when and where the M7s would be engaging, preventing friendly fire incidents. Ammunition allocation was adjusted to account for the higher consumption rates of direct fire missions. What had started as desperate improvisation became standard operating procedure, at least for Iwo Jima. The question of whether lessons from Iwo Jima would influence future doctrine remained open as the battleground toward its conclusion in mid-March 1945. Some officers argued vociferously that the M7's employment in direct fire should be studied and incorporated into training for future operations. If the invasion of Japan went forward, and in March 1945, that seemed inevitable, the experience of reducing heavily fortified positions would be directly applicable. Perhaps the M7 should be formally recognized as having a dual role: indirect fire support and direct bunker assault. Others maintained that Iwo Jima was an aberration, a unique situation that shouldn't drive doctrinal changes. The island's defensive preparations were extraordinarily elaborate, unlikely to be replicated elsewhere. Using self-propelled howitzers in direct fire roles was an expedient born of necessity, not a best practice to be enshrined in manuals. The proper solution was to develop weapons specifically designed for bunker reduction Heavier guns on better armored chassis, maybe, or improved flamethrower systems. Don't distort the artillery system's organization and training to accommodate one unusual campaign. These debates became moot with Japan's surrender in August 1945, before the planned invasions of the home islands could begin. But the tactical lessons learned on Iwo Jima's volcanic ash remained in the institutional memory of the Marine Corps. The crews who discovered that doctrine was no substitute for effectiveness, that weapons could be adapted to roles their designers never imagined, carried those lessons forward into their post-war careers. Some became instructors, teaching the next generation of Marines about improvisation and tactical flexibility. Others wrote accounts of their experiences, preserving the details of how they turned an indirect fire weapon into a bunker buster. The M7 Priest itself continued in service for years after World War II, seeing action in Korea and eventually being passed on to Allied nations. But it never again played quite the same role it had on Iwo Jima. Korea's terrain and enemy defenses didn't create the same desperate need for direct-fire bunker assault. Later conflicts employed different tactics and different weapons. The specific combination of circumstances that made the Priest into an improvised assault gun, the dense fortifications, the inadequacy of existing direct-fire weapons, the compressed terrain, didn't recur. What remained was the broader lesson. That combat has a way of making nonsense of carefully constructed doctrines, that weapons do what war demands rather than what designers intended, that the line between "this is how we're supposed to fight" and "this is how we have to fight" can disappear entirely under the pressure of battle. The crews who hammered their way through 14 bunkers in 90 minutes understood this instinctively. They weren't thinking about doctrine or design specifications. They were thinking about the Marines pinned down ahead of them, about the fortifications that needed to die, about doing whatever worked with whatever they had. That, ultimately, was the most illegal thing about the M7 Priest at Iwo Jima. Not the violation of employment doctrine. Violations of doctrine happen in every war. The truly transgressive act was the implicit rejection of the idea that doctrine mattered more than results, that doing things by the book took precedence over doing things that worked. The Priest crews didn't ask permission to become bunker hunters. They didn't wait for official authorization to use their weapons in unauthorized ways. They saw a need, had a capability, and made the connection. Everything else was paperwork. By early March 1945, the volcanic landscape of Iwo Jima had become a graveyard of tactical certainties. Everything the Marines thought they knew about amphibious assault had been tested, broken, and rebuilt in the crucible of Kuribayashi's Fortress Island. The M7 Priests, those ungainly vehicles with their pulpit-like machine gun mounts, had become symbols of a larger truth. Survival demanded adaptation, and adaptation didn't wait for permission. The human cost of this innovation was written in the casualty lists that mounted daily. The Priest crews who'd pioneered the bunker-busting technique paid a price for their effectiveness. Japanese defenders, recognizing the threat these vehicles posed, made them priority targets with a vengeance that spoke to their tactical importance. Every time a Priest moved forward into direct fire position, its crew accepted extraordinary risk. The open-topped fighting compartment that had been an acceptable design feature for indirect fire operations became a critical vulnerability when enemy positions could observe and engage the vehicle directly. Staff Sergeant James O'Malley's crew learned this lesson on March 4th, during operations near the northern end of the island. They had been supporting an assault by the 3rd Battalion, 28th Marines, systematically reducing bunkers that had stalled the infantry advance for 2 days. By mid-afternoon, they'd destroyed 6 positions, their technique refined through repetition into something approaching grim efficiency. The 7th bunker would be their last. The position sat in a slight depression, well protected by overlapping fields of fire from adjacent defensive works. O'Malley positioned his priest on a small rise that gave clear line of sight to the target, coordinating with infantry to suppress the supporting positions while his crew engaged the main bunker. They'd fired 8 rounds, each striking within feet of the previous impact, when a Japanese anti-tank gun that had remained silent and hidden chose that moment to reveal itself. The 47mm shell penetrated the M7's thin side armor at a shallow angle, entering the fighting compartment at waist height. The projectile killed the loader instantly and wounded 3 other crew members, including O'Malley. Worse, it ignited propellant charges stacked near the breach, creating a fire that threatened to detonate the remaining ammunition. O'Malley, bleeding from shrapnel wounds, ordered immediate evacuation. The driver, miraculously unwounded, got the vehicle moving despite the flames, backing away from the firing position while crew members bailed out. They'd covered barely 50 yards when the ammunition cooked off, the explosion tearing the priest apart and sending debris arcing across the battlefield. O'Malley survived his wounds, evacuated to a hospital ship where surgeons spent hours removing metal fragments. The driver received a Bronze Star for his actions in getting the vehicle away from the infantry it had been supporting, preventing casualties among the Marines who would have been caught in the blast. The loader was buried in the 5th Division Cemetery on Iwo Jima, one of thousands whose graves dotted this volcanic ash. The 3 wounded crew members eventually recovered, though none returned to combat. The priest itself was a total loss, reduced to twisted metal that salvage crews would eventually cut up for scrap. Stories like O'Malley's played out across the island through the battle's final weeks. Another crew was caught by a mortar barrage while resupplying ammunition, the shells walking through their position with methodical precision. 1 round landed directly in the fighting compartment, detonating among stacked 105mm shells. The blast was visible from observation posts a mile away, a pillar of flame and smoke that marked where 7 men had ceased to exist. Recovery teams found fragments, pieces of the vehicle, pieces of the crew, scattered across a 100-yard radius. There was nothing large enough to identify, nothing to bury except what could be scraped into sandbags. Yet the crews kept volunteering for these missions, even after losses made the risks undeniable, even after everyone understood that direct fire operations in an M7 meant accepting mortality rates more typical of infantry than artillery. Men stepped forward to crew the replacement vehicles. Some were motivated by vengeance. They'd lost friends to Japanese bunkers and wanted to destroy those fortifications personally. Others were driven by a grim sense of professional pride, wanting to prove they could do the job as well as the crews who'd pioneered the technique. A few simply believed this was the most effective way to support the infantry, and supporting the infantry was what Marines did. The psychological aftermath followed these men for decades. Corporal Richard Chen, a gunner who'd participated in the destruction of 17 bunkers during 3 weeks of operations, returned to civilian life in San Francisco after the war. He never spoke publicly about his experiences until 1978, when a local historian conducting interviews with Iwo Jima veterans persuaded him to record his memories. The transcript reveals a man still haunted by images from 33 years earlier. "You have to understand," Chen told the interviewer. "We could see everything. We weren't firing at coordinates on a map. We were looking at the bunkers, watching our shells hit, seeing the concrete crack and fail. Sometimes we'd see Japanese soldiers running from positions we'd just destroyed, trying to get to other bunkers. Sometimes they were on fire from white phosphorus. Sometimes they'd just collapse, wounded or dying. We'd keep firing because we had to, because that was the mission, but you can't unsee that kind of thing." Chen described the recurring nightmares that had plagued him for years after the war. Dreams where he was back in the M7's fighting compartment, loading and firing, in an endless cycle that never accomplished anything. The bunkers in his dreams never died, just kept absorbing shells indefinitely, while Marines died in front of them. He'd wake up shaking, the smell of powder smoke so vivid he could taste it, even though he was in his bedroom in California, decades removed from Iwo Jima's volcanic ash. The worst part, Chen continued, was knowing we were good at it. We got efficient at killing bunkers, at reading the construction to find weak points, at putting shells exactly where they needed to go. I was proud of that efficiency, still am in a way. We saved Marine lives. Every bunker we destroyed was one less position killing our guys. But being good at that kind of destruction, taking pride in it, does something to you, changes how you see yourself. Other crew members processed their experiences differently. Technical Sergeant William Dubois, a vehicle commander who'd led his crew through some of the heaviest fighting in the northern sector, emerged from Iwo Jima with what we'd now recognize as severe post-traumatic stress. In 1945, the Marine Corps called it combat fatigue and offered limited treatment. Dubois was hospitalized briefly, then returned to duty with a rear echelon unit in Hawaii, deemed unfit for further combat operations. He struggled with alcohol dependency for years, lost multiple jobs, and eventually ended up homeless in Los Angeles in the early 1950s. A VA outreach worker found Dubois living in a culvert near the Los Angeles River in 1954, 9 years after Iwo Jima. The worker, himself a World War II veteran, recognized the symptoms and got Dubois into a veterans hospital. Treatment was rudimentary by modern standards. Talk therapy, occupational training, medication for anxiety, but it was enough to give Dubois some stability. He eventually found work as a machinist, married, fathered 2 children. He never fully escaped what Iwo Jima had done to him, but he found ways to manage it, to build a life despite the memories. Dubois' daughter, interviewed in 2003 for a documentary about Iwo Jima veterans, remembered a father who'd been loving but distant, prone to sudden mood shifts and long silences. There were times when he'd just stare at nothing for hours, she recalled. Mom would explain that Dad had been in the war, that he'd seen terrible things, and we needed to be patient. I didn't understand until I was older what that meant, what carrying those memories cost him. He never talked about specifics, never told war stories like some veterans did. Whatever he saw on Iwo Jima, he kept it locked away. The physical casualties, the dead and wounded, could be counted and recorded in official reports. The psychological casualties were harder to quantify. How many men came home from Iwo Jima carrying invisible wounds that would shape the rest of their lives? How many priest crew members struggled with nightmares, anxiety, depression, survivor's guilt? The records don't capture this, partly because the vocabulary for discussing psychological trauma was limited in the 1940s, partly because many veterans never sought help or acknowledged their struggles. What the records do capture is the tactical effectiveness of the improvised bunker-busting technique. Unit after action reports consistently noted the M7's value in reducing fortifications. One battalion commander wrote, "The 105mm self-propelled gun proved invaluable in destroying enemy emplacements. Its mobility allowed it to shift positions rapidly, and its heavier shell was far more effective against concrete fortifications than the 75mm tank gun. Recommend increased allocation of these weapons for future operations against heavily fortified positions." Another report, from a regimental operations officer, detailed specific engagements. On D+14, Company F encountered a bunker complex that resisted all attempts at reduction. Sherman tanks fired approximately 60 rounds with minimal effect. Naval gunfire was called in but failed to destroy the positions. An M7 self-propelled gun was brought forward and engaged the bunkers at ranges of 150 to 200 yards. After sustained fire totaling 38 rounds, all positions in the complex were destroyed or abandoned. Total time from M7 engagement to position secured, 47 minutes. Marine casualties during this period, 2 wounded. Estimated Marine casualties if position had been reduced by conventional assault, 20 to 30 killed or wounded. The mathematics were brutal, but undeniable. Using M7s in direct fire saved Marine lives, even accounting for the casualties among the priest crews themselves. The cost-benefit analysis, conducted in the bloodless language of military efficiency, favored the unorthodox tactic. This didn't make the losses any less tragic. The families of men killed in M7s mourned just as deeply as any other Gold Star families. But in the context of a battle, where every tactical decision involved calculating acceptable casualties, the priests' effectiveness justified their employment. The legacy of this innovation extended beyond Iwo Jima's immediate aftermath. When Marine Corps planners began preparing for the invasion of Japan, Operation Downfall, scheduled for November 1945, the lessons from Iwo Jima heavily influenced their thinking. Intelligence estimates suggested that the Japanese home islands would be even more heavily fortified than Iwo Jima, with defenses prepared over a longer period and protecting terrain that offered more natural advantages to defenders. Planning documents from mid-1945 showed that the Marines intended to significantly increase the allocation of M7s to assault divisions, specifically for direct-fire bunker reduction. One proposal called for creating specialized bunker destroyer platoons, each equipped with 4 M7s and trained exclusively for direct fire operations against fortifications. These units would have operated semi-independently from divisional artillery, attached directly to infantry regiments where they could respond quickly to requests for fire support. The proposal also suggested modifications to the M7 design to make it more suitable for the direct fire role. Recommendations included increasing frontal armor thickness, even if this reduced overall mobility, developing a protected gunner's position to reduce crew exposure, installing additional machine guns for close defense against infantry assault, and creating stowage for more ammunition to support extended engagements. Some of these modifications were actually implemented on a small scale, with a handful of M7s receiving field upgrades in preparation for Olympic, the planned invasion of Kyushu. Japan's surrender in August 1945 rendered these plans irrelevant. The invasion never happened. The bunker destroyer platoons never formed. The modified priests never saw combat. But the planning process itself demonstrated how thoroughly the Iwo Jima experience had influenced Marine Corps thinking about fortification reduction. The improvisation that had seemed so radical in February had become accepted doctrine by August. The question of whether this doctrinal shift was correct remained debatable. Proponents argued that Iwo Jima had proven the M7's value in direct fire, that refusing to formalize this capability would mean ignoring hard-won tactical lessons. The vehicle existed. It was effective in the role. Why not train crews and develop tactics to maximize that effectiveness? The artillery purists countered that purpose-built weapons would always outperform improvised solutions, that diverting M7s to direct-fire missions weakened the artillery support that was their primary function, that the solution to bunkers wasn't misusing howitzers but building better assault guns. Both sides had valid points, and the debate never fully resolved because it became academic. The Marine Corps never again faced defensive preparations quite like Kuribayashi's masterwork. Korea saw heavy fortifications in places, but the mobile nature of much of that war meant bunker reduction wasn't the sustained, grinding necessity it had been on Iwo Jima. Vietnam's fighting occurred in jungles and villages where heavy concrete bunkers were rare. Later conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan occasionally involved fortified positions, but by then the M7 had long since been retired. replaced by more modern self-propelled artillery systems. The M7 itself soldiered on through the Korean War, where its flexibility proved valuable in the mountainous terrain that dominated much of the fighting. The vehicle's limited elevation, that 35-degree maximum that had seemed adequate in World War II, became problematic when trying to shell enemy positions on reverse slopes of steep Korean hills. This led to the development of the M7B2 variant, which raised the howitzer mount to allow 65 degrees of elevation. But this Korean War service was conventional artillery work, indirect fire in support of infantry and armor. The direct fire bunker busting role remained specific to Iwo Jima. By the late 1950s, the M7 was being phased out of American service, replaced by the M109 self-propelled howitzer and other modern systems. Many of the retired priests were transferred to Allied nations through military assistance programs. Some served into the 1960s and 70s with foreign armies. A few survive today as museum pieces, their battered hulls mute testimony to battles fought decades ago. None of these surviving vehicles carry any markings indicating they participated in Iwo Jima's fighting, let alone that they were used in the unorthodox bunker-busting role. The physical evidence of that innovation has largely disappeared, preserved only in photographs, documents, and fading memories. The crew members who pioneered the technique scattered to civilian life after the war. Most never spoke publicly about their experiences, absorbing their memories into the private landscape of things survived rather than things celebrated. A few wrote letters or journals that eventually found their way into military archives, providing fragmentary accounts of what it was like to crew an M7 in direct fire against Japanese bunkers. These documents, written in the spare, understated prose typical of combat veterans, offer glimpses into experiences that defy easy summary. One gunner, whose name is redacted in the archived letter, wrote to a friend in 1947, "You asked what it was like on Iwo. I don't know how to explain it in a way that makes sense. We did things with that priest that would have gotten us court-martialed in training. We drove it up to bunkers like it was a tank, fired point-blank at concrete we couldn't penetrate, kept firing until something gave way. Lost good men doing it, saw things I wish I could forget. But we killed those bunkers, cleared the way for the infantry, did our part. That's all there is to say about it, really. We did what needed doing." Another crew member, writing in a memoir published privately in 1986, reflected on the moral complexities of the work. "People ask if I'm proud of my service. I tell them yes, but it's complicated. I'm proud we stopped the Japanese, proud we won the war, proud of the Marines I served with. But pride isn't the right word for what we did with that priest. We got good at destroying things, at killing people inside bunkers who never had a chance once we started firing. That's not something to be proud of. It's something that needed doing, something we did because the alternative was worse. There's a difference." The broader lessons from the M7's employment on Iwo Jima extended beyond the specific weapon or tactic. The experience demonstrated the importance of tactical flexibility, of empowering junior leaders to adapt to circumstances rather than rigidly following doctrine. The crews who first used priests against bunkers didn't wait for approval from higher command. They saw a problem, had a potential solution, and implemented it. This kind of initiative, this willingness to experiment and adapt, became part of the Marine Corps' institutional culture in ways that are difficult to quantify but impossible to ignore. Military education programs incorporated Iwo Jima case studies into their curricula, using examples like the M7's employment to illustrate principles of innovation under pressure. Officer candidates studied the battle to understand how tactical problems emerge when doctrine meets reality, how weapons can be adapted beyond their designed roles, how desperation can drive creativity. The specific details mattered less than the broader lessons. Rigidity kills, adaptation survives, effectiveness matters more than orthodoxy. These lessons resonated through subsequent decades of American military operations. When armor crews in Iraq used Abrams tanks in urban support roles they hadn't trained for, they were following the same improvisational tradition the M7 crews had pioneered. When artillery units in Afghanistan employed their systems in direct-fire missions against Taliban positions, they were echoing tactics developed on Iwo Jima's volcanic ash. The specific technologies changed, but the underlying principle remained constant. Use what you have, how you need to use it, to accomplish the mission. The men who crewed those priests are mostly gone now. The last Iwo Jima veterans are in their late 90s or have passed on, taking their memories with them. The historian's window for direct interviews has nearly closed. What remains are the documents, the photographs, the after-action reports, written in the dry language of military bureaucracy. These sources preserve the facts. The units involved, the casualties suffered, the tactical results achieved. What they capture less well are the human experiences, the fear and exhaustion and grim determination that characterized those weeks of fighting. But some things can be inferred from the patterns in the records. The crews that destroyed the most bunkers tended to be those with the longest experience working together. Coordination mattered. The crew that functioned as a single organism, each member anticipating the other's actions, achieved better results with fewer losses than newly assembled crews still learning to work together. Leadership mattered too. Vehicle commanders who could read the tactical situation, who knew when to press forward and when to withdraw, who could coordinate effectively with supporting infantry, kept their crews alive longer and accomplished more. The physical courage required simply to climb into an M7 and drive it toward a Japanese bunker shouldn't be underestimated. These men knew the risks. They'd seen priests destroyed, seen crews burned or blown apart. They understood that the vehicle's thin armor wouldn't stop any serious anti-tank weapon, that the open fighting compartment made them vulnerable to every kind of indirect fire, that Japanese defenders had made them priority targets. They climbed in anyway, day after day, mission after mission, until the island was secured or they became casualties themselves. This kind of courage, sustained, repeated, conscious acceptance of mortal risk, deserves recognition beyond the medals and commendations some received. It represents something fundamental about the human capacity to function under extreme stress, to continue performing complex tasks when every survival instinct screams for retreat. The priest crews on Iwo Jima demonstrated this capacity in full measure. They weren't superhuman. They were ordinary young men, most barely out of their teens, thrust into circumstances that demanded extraordinary performance. And they delivered. The final accounting of the M7's contribution to Iwo Jima's outcome is difficult to calculate precisely. No comprehensive record exists of how many bunkers were destroyed by priests versus other weapon systems. The fragmentary reports suggest dozens, possibly over 100 fortifications reduced by direct fire from M7s during the battle's 36 days. Each of these represented a position that would have cost Marine lives to assault conventionally, a strong point removed from Kuribayashi's defensive network, a step closer to the island's eventual capture. The innovation's true significance lay not in the raw numbers, but in what it represented. The refusal to accept that problems were insoluble simply because doctrine didn't provide ready answers. The Marines on Iwo Jima faced fortifications that conventional tactics couldn't efficiently reduce. Rather than accepting this limitation, they experimented with unorthodox solutions. The M7 became one of those solutions, not because anyone planned it that way, but because crews and commanders were willing to try something different. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.